Awesome.
Hello, hello. Are we on air now? Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion for the M word for Pan America's festival, which is No Country for Young Muslim Women. So we are here. We're your girls, Amani and Yassmin. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of MuslimGirl.com, the biggest platform for Muslim women's voices in the States. And I'm joined by my girl Yassmin, who's actually tuning in from London. Yassmin, want to introduce yourself and explain what is going on here? How come you're not here?
Thank you, Amani. First, to everyone tuning in, thank you all so much. My name is Yassmin Abdel-Magied. I'm a whole bunch of different things. I'm an engineer, a mechanical engineer. I'm a writer, and a broadcaster, and I guess also someone who couldn't make it into the United States for this event. So some of you may be aware this was meant to be an in-person event. But on my way into the United States last week, I was stopped and refused entry at the border, which was kind of way ironic given the fact that I was talking about, I was to appear on a panel called No Country for Young Muslim Women. And, the details have been kind of widely reported, but essentially I was on a visa that had come in many times before. It hadn't ever been an issue. But the way that the customs officers behaved and the kind of conversations we had clearly indicated that, there was enough of a gray area and they decided that I shouldn't be allowed entry. And essentially they offered me two options. One was to voluntarily return, or to be put in jail overnight and be banned for 5 years. So I decided to voluntarily return. And here we are, because as Amani said just before we got on, not even, a little deportation can keep us away from having this conversation.
Wait, so what was the issue? They said that they took up an issue with the visa?
Yeah, so it's a bit of, and I'm not going to get into it too much because my lawyers are kind of working on it at the moment. But essentially, it was a visa that I'd been on many times before to do the exact kind of work that I was coming in to do. But the border officers have a lot of discretion, right? And if they, for whatever reason, don't think that you should be allowed in, and also, I guess a little bit of context, I was born in Sudan. I go to Sudan quite regularly. Sudan, the reason I was on that visa to begin with was to get me entry into the United States when the Muslim ban happened. But even then, it was a kind of case of we don't know if they'll allow you in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of last year when the Muslim ban originally was introduced. And that was the initial thing that raised flags when I got to the customs officer, because I'm on an Australian passport. So, yeah, it's been an interesting week. And I think, it couldn't have illustrated the situation more clearly, right? Like you can, and for, I think lots and lots of people, in the same ways in many situations are like, oh, there must be some other legitimate reason why, this would have happened. Like people don't like to think there might ever be bias. People don't like to think there might ever be any other reason, right? It's like recently there was that thing, and I know we're not specifically talking about race, but there was a couple of young black guys in the US that got arrested, in Starbucks. And that was quite a story because people, the person that essentially tweeted about it said something really poignant, which I thought was really important, and I think applies here. It's like you often look at a situation and you think, oh, there must be a reason for this injustice. Like there must be some sort of logical, discernible, rational reason for an injustice to have occurred. And so you often will kind of look at ways to not even necessarily blame, but explain it in a way that makes sense to you, because we like to think the world is fair. We like to, in our minds, we want to believe that this was fine.
Either that or they try to find like explanations or excuses to kind of justify that bias, right? Like instead of saying that a bias exists, they'll look for like any excuse possible. Like in this situation, for example, it's like, oh, a technicality over like the visa, and this is why like you can't enter the country. And in other situations, like a technicality over like a young man putting his hand into his pocket and like that being used as a justification for something. I totally agree. Actually, I was in a similar situation last year after Trump got elected. I was coming into the country from a Muslim country. I was on a flight that was predominantly Muslim. a lot of women wearing headscarves and stuff like that. But of course, like I'm an American citizen, born and raised here. And I was at the very front of passport controls at the very beginning of the line. So like, I hustled my way over there at JFK. And so there's like this long line of, you know, Muslim men and women behind me. And when I walked up to the passport control officer, he like looks at my passport and then looks at me and he says, okay, now take that thing off your head. Literally like in front of, like in this wide open space, in front of, like in passport control, in front of everyone and stuff like that. And I was just like, no. And also I was wearing a headscarf in my passport, so there's literally no reason. And so I was like, no, actually, I know my rights and, you know, I have a right to keep this on my head. It's for religious purposes, so I'm not going to remove it. And he actually says to me, actually, you're on the border, so you have no rights here. So take it off. And he starts like arguing with me there. So yeah, like he was basically saying, and it wasn't until I said, you know, I'm an American citizen. Give me your, you know, supervisor, and I'm going to sue the crap out of you guys for violating my rights, that they actually were like hastily like letting me pass and like stamping my passport and stuff just to get me out of there. But it's like, you see that, you know, kind of like that vulnerability that comes with being like not, you know, a member of the soil that you're on, and how that is used to kind of, you know, define where your place is and how you can be treated. It's almost like our rights are kind of like, you know, almost conditional.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. It's interesting you say that, because that was the exact conversation that I had with the kind of border control people. They were like, you don't actually, and this is, I mean, apparently it's quite true, but I didn't realize this. If you haven't entered the country yet, you don't have rights to a lawyer. You don't have rights to, you know, call anyone. The officer confiscated my phone, was very, very kind of like stern and aggressive in her tone. And none of those things are conducive to, you know, a good relationship. None of those things are conducive to things working themselves out. And it's interesting you say the kind of rights that you have as, you know, somebody who's from that particular soil. I also don't necessarily think that is, even if you are of that particular soil, you don't always get conferred those rights. You know, you know, part of the reason I'm in London is because I spent the majority of last year being kind of attacked in the Australian press for all sorts of different reasons, despite the fact that I am Australian and I've been brought up there and quite proud and represented Australia across the world in all sorts of different forums. But the reality is, again, once you sort of step outside the bounds of what people think is acceptable for your particular place, whether that's you being a woman, a young person, a Muslim, a person of color, then people are not okay with that. They cannot handle it, and they really turn on you. And that is whether you are in a Western country, I think, or even in a majority Muslim country, right? I spend a lot of time. I'd be interested, Amani, in your thoughts on this. Like, what I think there is like no country for young Muslim women. I think, you know, what country in the world could I go to as a young Muslim woman of color where I will know that I will be totally safe, that people like me are valued and are looked after and are perhaps one of, you know, if not the most important kind of group of people, at least equal with the most important group of people. But where in the world does that exist? Even going to Sudan, you know, women, unfortunately, don't necessarily have the same sorts of rights. And that's because of a whole bunch of cultural reasons. I very deeply believe that's not to do with Islam. It is a whole bunch of cultural reasons. But that's the reality. Is I will go and there will be a particular type of gender role that I'm expected to fill, a particular type of policing that happens towards women. And it's actually kind of madness to think, where in the world could I go? Yeah.
It's really sad when you think about it. And like hearing you say that honestly like hits me in the gut, because it's so true. And you know, I don't think that it's also just the fact that, you know, you're a woman, for example, but also the fact that we're also in the diaspora. You know, like, it seems like at this stage we've become like so displaced that it's like we're too ethnic, whatever that is, for like our Western home countries, and then we're also too westernized, whatever that is, for like our parents' home countries. And so it's like, where do we necessarily fit in? And I think that trend is also something globalized. Like, this is a global thing, you know, like last year, one situation that I found myself in, which was, you know, almost identical, was when I was in Europe after Brexit happened. And I was entering I was entering the country of France through Nice, like through the south of France border. And I was stopped by Border Patrol there, and they forced me to remove my headscarf. And they straight up said, "You're in France now. This is how we do things. We don't wear those around here." And they forced me, they threatened me with deportation and forced me to remove my headscarf for no reason. Because again, my photo in my passport, I was wearing a headscarf. I remember telling the officer, like when I had my scarf removed, which of course was a symbol of subjugating you and putting you in your place and showing that they're in control. I remember asking them, I was like, "So does this help with your identification purposes?" Like, because pretty sure I look even less like my passport photo now than I do with my scarf on, you know? But I think that's what it comes down to. It's like putting the Muslim woman in her place. And when we talk about, you know, like what you mentioned about there's no country on earth, there is no country for young Muslim women. Similar experience happened to me when I was entering a Muslim country, unfortunately. When I was entering the UAE, I was stopped at the border. You know, I'm like, you know, I guess as this like American girl coming in with like her Asian and stuff like that. And I remember like the Arab male officer that stopped me, he literally wanted to put me in my place before I entered. He thought that I was like, you know, some whatever, like Arab American girl, like coming in thinking that she was like the shit and something. And then, you know, he was forcing me to, you know, like take off any extra clothing that I had on that didn't need to be on. He made me take my contacts out of my eyes. He made me separate myself from my agent. He made me, and things like that, basically just like strip me down, get me down to remembering the fact, like, you are here, this is your place, and you're under our control here, no matter what, like who you think you are or where you come from, you know? So it's like, it's very unsettling, because it's almost like a treatment that we have come to expect as women in particular, and especially as Muslim women, especially as women of color. And I know, Yassmin, you probably have like so much more to add to that as a Black woman, as a Black Muslim woman entering these spaces, both within Western culture and Muslim culture, especially, where these hierarchies like still exist, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I think the one, you know, going into spaces, say in North Africa and so on, that are majority Muslim, the one privilege that I do have is that I'm a light-skinned Black woman, you know, and ironically, you know, that well, maybe not ironically, but it does play a part. The fact that I'm not a dark-skinned Black person, the fact that I'm, you know, that I speak Arabic allows me some sort of level of privilege within that community, but still it's kind of like, I mean, the word that is used by Arabs to refer to Sudanese people is abd, which is literally slave.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's how they will talk about people like us. Like, in some cases, that's still the term that Egyptians use about Sudanese people. And it's also quite fascinating, because we don't often, I think, as Western Muslims, or as young Muslims who've grown up in the West, talk about these complexities within the Muslim community, because there's so little space anyway to talk about the kind of challenges that we face as a broader Muslim community in living in the West. And so we don't want to kind of air our dirty laundry. We don't want to be like, oh, there's challenges. But the reality is, for Muslim women, the challenge is on both fronts, right? It is, you know, to the kind of Western public, to the communities that are super Islamophobic and super racist and whatever, or simply want to use Islamophobia and so on as political division. But also within the Muslim community, unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to be done as well. Like, we as women have to do all this work to reclaim our faith back from, you know, the patriarchal constructs in which it has been molded over hundreds and hundreds of years. And like, that in itself is exhausting work. So it's really, I mean, sometimes I sit down and I just think, where is the space where, like, imagine not ever having to think about all these political consequences and ramifications of every single aspect of our identity. I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, Amani, which is that it is a global thing, and it's a diaspora thing. And I think, in a way, although sometimes it can feel like it's something that only young Muslim women or young Black Muslim women can relate to, in some ways the fragmentation of our identities is relatable to an entire generation of young people.
For sure.
And I like, you know, recently made really good friends with a young French American woman here in London. And, you know, our worlds are so different, but we bond over the fact that we're born one place, our parents are in another place, we've lived in another place our whole lives. And like, that sense of identity, whether it's, you know, from a racial or a language or a faith-based, the way that I think politics is going is about drawing borders and fragmentation, as opposed to sort of saying, well, actually, that's not really going to help this next generation at all. That is looking to the past instead of looking to the future. And all of us and the generation below us, we don't know a world that is split up that way. We know a world that is globalized. Obviously, again, there is the privilege of wealth in that. But I think it's really interesting to think, like, how is this learning? How is this life? How are the things that we kind of glean from this kind of existence useful for the broader conversation? That's me trying to get a silver lining, essentially.
I mean, even just to take it a step further, like, even in addition to the ways that our identities are like fragmented and stuff, it's also like which fragments are claimed by which identity, right? Because like, so one really interesting position I have found myself in, thanks to Twitter trolls, thanks guys, hey, shout out, is basically, like, I have actually been accused on Twitter by a lot of like very alt-right trolls and stuff like that, that I'm actually an undercover white woman that's posing as a Muslim woman and only wears the headscarf for the views.
Wow. What?
Because get this, because apparently there's no way that a Muslim woman can be touting these progressive, feminist, whatever, like speaking points and stuff like that. Or, you know, aside from that outrageous, you know, I guess, conspiracy theory, there's also, it's literally like, you know, one thing that I get all the time is, oh, well, you only are a feminist, or you only believe in progressive principles because you are American, because you were born and raised in the West. It's like, you know, using the West to claim principles that I believe have been founded by Islam a thousand years ago, you know? And then also, in addition to that, you know, this silencing, I consider it to be a silencing tactic of when people outside of the Muslim community and non-Muslims say things like, well, why are you complaining about Islamophobia with all of the violence being inflicted on Muslim women in Muslim countries? You know, as if there's some type of hierarchy or superiority in terms of the violence that is inflicted upon us as Muslim women. So it's literally like no country for a young Muslim woman. But even though there's no country for us, there's still this hierarchy going on of like, wait, our violence is better than their violence, you guys. Like, at least find this acceptable. You know what I mean? And it's just like, it's literally adding this like racist dynamic even to the racist violence that we have to put up with, you know? So it's like, there's so many layers to it. And I mean, I personally find so much offense to people trying to, you know, give credit to Westernism for my beliefs that are empowered by my Islamic faith, for example. I think that's also a way to kind of undermine, you know, what Islam really is, to keep it confined within a box definition of, you know, who Muslims are, who Muslim women are, what they should sound like, what they should look like, how they carry themselves and stuff like that. But also, it's just the idea that we as Muslim women, you know, just the fact that we come from the Muslim background, that we somehow have to answer to or are impacted by violence happening to Muslim women on other parts of the world. It's literally as ludicrous as saying, you know, like that American Christian women have to answer to the violence that, you know, Christian women in like some European country have to endure or something. It's like, what? There's literally no connection there besides the fact that we come from this similar religious faith. We might even practice it differently, but that also all of these things just are still along the you know, the rationale that we are one homogenous group, or that we can be spoken about or represented as if we are one monolith, when it's simply impossible to discuss Muslim women and the variety of issues that they endure in that way. I mean, just you and I alone, Yassmin, like, we go through two totally different types of problems, you know, like different frameworks that we're both up against and stuff, and yet we're both Muslim women. You know, and we are so alike in so many other ways, but it's a totally different lived experience.
100%. I mean, I think so. Okay, so many things there that I want to respond to and unpack. One of the things that you pointed out, I think, reflects Edward Said, who wrote one of like my favorite books, Orientalism, talks about how. And if people are interested, Edward Said is a great person to read, to look at. He has another book about how Islam is actually represented in the media and in the West. And he talks about how the Muslim woman is always represented as the opposite of what the Western woman is, right? So back in the day when the Western woman was like covered up and wore long dresses and this and this and this, the Muslim woman was like, you know, this deviant kind of, you know, they all lived in harems and they were like sultry and seductive and blah, 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 blah. And now that the Western woman is someone who, you know, again, generalizations, but finds liberation in taking clothes off, et cetera, then therefore the opposite is the Muslim woman who covers up and is oppressed. And so it's always, it's part of this kind of broader narrative about Islam, which kind of, again, you know, you can take back to like colonial times, which is about, you know, this is a movement that, and this is a faith and the sort of powers that be see it as a broad, dangerous thing, so want to position it in a way that makes people either fear it or think it's the wrong thing or whatever. And that has happened kind of historically. And it's also so interesting to me that people cannot seem to listen to Muslim women, right? So like you will have two, like me and you will both say that Islam to us is feminist. We get our feminist or we get our like gender equality ideals from our faith, and people will turn themselves into knots, essentially twist themselves into knots in order to find ways to be like, no, you don't understand yourself. Like they completely remove the agency. They cannot simply believe what is in front of them, which is hilarious because mark my words, if some like, you know, white academic decided to read the Quran and then talk about how Islam in the Quran was really feminist, people would be like, oh my God, look at this new interpretation, like how incredible, blah, 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 blah. It would be, you know, the guy'd probably win a Pulitzer, right? Let's be real. But us having a conversation about what our faith means to us, like I said on a panel last year that Islam to me was the most feminist religion because it's something that I do believe deeply. And that's very different from saying that all Muslims are feminists, because I'm not justifying the behavior of every Muslim, but I'm saying the faith that I believe in the way that I understand it has truly gender equal ideals, right? And the response was like hilarious in its ridiculousness, you know? And I think that is also an indication of people's difficulty to understand perhaps ways of seeing the world that are different. It's like you look different to me, or you say you believe in something that's different to me. Therefore, I'm not going to be able to see you as a human being with, you know, thoughts and and an ideology that I can respect. Like I'm just, it's too confronting. And the one thing that I wanted to say earlier, that you were talking about in your last border control situation. There's so many border control situations.
Is that like, which one are you referring to?
Which one? Yeah. The thing is, right, like I was talking to a couple of people after I came back to London, and you know, they might be like, well, or people said to me things like, oh, you know, it's not that big of a deal. Like, you know, maybe they said this, or maybe they made you do this, or maybe they took away your phone for a little while, or maybe this, but like you're fine. And I think it's very different. It's a very different experience to go through something like that as a person who's very accustomed to understanding their place in the world versus someone who has never known that there is a very real danger to their lives and their livelihoods because of the situation at hand. Like if you are, again, a person of privilege in terms of you are a white, straight male, for example, going through border security, you have a sense of kind of assuredness that the system has your back. Like you believe in the rule of law. You believe that the rule of law is there to protect you. But I don't believe the rule of law is there to protect me. In fact, I know that some of the laws out there are there to find ways to make life more difficult for me and for you and for people like me and you. And so I think it makes even a small thing actually a much bigger threat. Even though something might seem small, it is actually a much bigger threat because it represents something that, like, it represents a much larger possible consequence than simply some guy being rude to me. The border security person or the border control person being very rude and aggressive to me can end up in me getting shot and then them not going to jail kind of vibe. Like, that's the risk that we're talking about. Yeah. Not just, you know, a little bit of discomfort for a few hours. And because that's a very real risk in the back of your mind, all of a sudden it it takes on a totally different kind of view. You know what I mean? It's very real. It's very real.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, especially with, you know, the absolute truth that it's like, if you don't have a lived experience that makes you already hyper aware of these nuances, then you're less likely, you know, or you're more likely to be that person that searches for the real reason or justification why it happened and stuff. I mean, just to kind of like prove your point, you know, like that discrepancy that they stopped you from entering the States on, right? About the wrong visa, having like a work visa versus a recreational one, I guess, or whatever.
Business, so business versus work.
Yeah, I actually, so one of the last times that I was visiting the UK when I was entering London, pretty sure the border patrol officer was trying really hard to find that discrepancy with my paperwork as well. And I remember telling one of my friends, I was going there for a conference, and one of my guy friends was with me, who was also attending the same conference. I remember making some comment to him beforehand, like, oh God, like I'm gonna get stopped, whatever. And he was like, okay, Manny, like, why are you expecting that? Like, no, it's not a thing and stuff. Lo and behold, he ends up speeding straight through in literally like 2 minutes. Meanwhile, I got held up for over a half an hour with this officer literally just poking and prodding and asking me all these extremely invasive questions that he wasn't entitled to ask and that no one else was being asked either. But it's like, it just shows that if they want to find a reason, they will search for it. Luckily for me, sorry, Yassmin, but like I had the right visa. Actually, I like legitimately like was not there for work or anything. So he couldn't find it, but like he was searching for it. Like he wanted that thing that he'd get hung up on, you know, it's like turned me away and stuff. And then I remember afterwards, after I got through, and my friend was like, yo, I've been waiting for you for like 30 minutes. What the hell? He's like, you were right. Like I finished in a couple of minutes. Like I sped right through that. That was the only way that he got it, right? It's like by literally showing the side by side, like the parallel experiences. Otherwise, it gets very difficult to try to conceptualize that to a person. It's like, no, actually, as people of color, things can get a little bit stickier, you know, but for sure.
And you're right. Like, I think it's hard sometimes for people to comprehend what it's like, you know, to comprehend what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes. And so, I mean, that's also why, like, what you do at Muslim Girl is so important. And that's why, like, I'm obsessed with representation and increasing representation in every possible form, because I think the more that people are familiar with the stories of Muslim women, the more that they're aware of what it's like to walk into the shoes of a Muslim. And that can be through popular culture, that can be through television, through film, through whatever, and stuff that's made on our terms, not some, like, you know, somebody goes to Saudi Arabia for 2 weeks and wears a niqab and tries to like figure out what it's like to be a Saudi person. Yeah. But, you know, people actually, young Muslim people, like actually telling their own stories and showing the plurality of it and showing also just the things that we have to think about on a daily basis. Like I all of my friends, for example, I'm like, please all download Signal. Please all, like, you know, I'm like super paranoid about all this technology stuff. And they're like, Yassmin, why are you paranoid? I'm like, listen, I got held up at border control for how long? And they confiscated my phone. Like, I don't trust authorities because, you know, everyone on Guantanamo Bay, they're not there on charges. They've not been charged with anything. They've got like vague kind of ideas of these people are threats. I don't know what it takes for someone to be deemed a threat. And I know, what I do know, though, is anyone who causes a fuss, right? Anyone who causes waves. And the reality is, in many ways, our unapologetic existence causes waves, whatever country we're in.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure just being Muslim is a qualifier in that front.
Our very existence causes waves. So our very existence is a threat in some of these situations. Our very existence is a threat potentially in a Western nation, potentially back in Sudan, potentially in, like, you know, and again, I don't necessarily, like, maybe going to China would be very different. Maybe going to live in Indonesia, Malaysia would be different and you wouldn't face the issues. But I'm pretty sure that the people that, like, the experiences that I've heard don't give me much hope that things would be kind of as, like, any rosier. And so it's fascinating to kind of grapple with the reality that your existence itself is what people have a problem with. And in a way, though, Amani, I have found it almost freeing, right? Because I'm like, you know what? my very existence is going to make them upset, well, I guess I can't really do anything about that. But what I can then do, if they're going to be upset anyway, is live my life as unapologetically as possible. Speak what I see to be true as unapologetically as possible. Create the space for other young Muslim women, other young Black Muslim women, other young women of color to be able to sort of like show their truth. And inshallah, hopefully that gets us to the point where we are creating our own content, where we are creating our own, like you guys at Muslim Girl are doing that, where we are creating our own stories and being able to have not only just conversations on our own terms, but essentially creating entire spaces and systems on our own terms. Because I think until that happens, we're always going to be kind of within somebody else's system, and none of those systems are really set up for us.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I mean, that's the whole point, is so that we can be able to like share things on our own terms and talk back to them on our own terms. And I think, you know, my passion for having a claim over my narrative, I think is also an extension of like the sheer anxiety that I feel knowing that as a Muslim woman, like my body, like my physical body is vulnerable, especially with the current political climate, right? Like I feel like nothing for me personally triggers me like feeling like I'm in a situation where, yeah, your body is not under your control, right? When you're like when you're at the border. Yeah. And yeah, you can catch like any random accusation or misunderstanding or whatever to deem you as a national security threat simply because of the fact that you look different. And then what happens to you then? You know, the fact that even, you know, like when entering the UAE, you know, like Muslim soil, and still feeling like your body is under the control of like another entity as a Muslim woman, and that another force has really just, they're able to tell you what to do. They have control over you. They can decide your fate, basically. It is a very, very vulnerable position. I think it's one that, you know, it's especially imperative for us as Muslim women, because I do think that a lot of the policies that we see taking shape right now that are taking life, like the Muslim ban, they're all just remnants of a lot of these misunderstandings about the Muslim people that have been built on the backs of Muslim women, especially. Like they have been built on our bodies, whether it's the war on terror, where we literally were used as the justification for that. You know, like Muslim women are oppressed. Look at the way that they're being mistreated. We need to liberate them. We need blah, 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 right? Launching wars in the Middle East that have disproportionately impacted Muslim women's bodies, children's bodies more than anybody else. It does feel like we are the flag bearers. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, given the fact that we literally are wearing like the modern symbol of the flag of Islam on our heads, right? And in that way, it is making us like walking targets. I mean, in the United States alone, we have become one of the most visible religious minorities in the country. And as a direct result of this past election cycle, we literally saw a spike in hate crimes impacting Muslim women specifically. You know, like we had a situation just last Ramadan in which a young 17-year-old teenage girl, Nabra Hassanin, she was Black, she wore a headscarf, she was going home from the mosque with her friends during Ramadan one night, and she was kidnapped off the street, raped and beaten to death, and had her body thrown into a pond. And stories like that don't make the news. You know, like it shocks me when I speak at like high schools and universities here, when I bring up Nabra Hassanin's name and no one has heard of her, even though it sent shockwaves through the Muslim community, because for us, it literally was the embodiment of our worst fears of the current political climate, everything that, you know, the Trump administration has come to represent for the Muslim community. Yeah. But what does that say when the only stories that we hear about in the news are always painting Muslims in a negative light? And then when we show the impact of that, the real violent result that we were forced to endure because of that misrepresentation, that doesn't get nearly anywhere near as much attention as, you know, like negative actions do, then how are we ever really able to identify the problem, first of all, of Islamophobia, shine a light on it, and ultimately combat it if we can't even bring ourselves to address it in the first place?
What gives you hope, Amani?
After that question, you want to? You want to lay that one on me, Yassmin?
Because I feel you. Like it's systematically, structurally, it's quite dire. And we're at one end of it where we sort of, our alhamdulillah, your bread and butter, your shelter, that kind of thing is taken care of. But what it is, the kind of battle is almost psychological, or yes, also to your physical body, but also it's like this sense
and
of being
also that women like you and I, we represent some of the most privileged Muslim women on the planet.
Yeah, exactly. So that was going to be my other point. It's like, we are so lucky in the kind of grand scheme of things that we can actually continue to talk about this stuff and don't have lives that have been disrupted by war, and don't have lives, that have been like intimately disrupted by forces that do disrupt. Like it makes me so frustrated that I don't know.
Yeah.
Even with all the privilege, right? You would think that it's kind of both ends. It's like, even with all the privilege, we still have these struggles, which kind of, I think, goes to show that how far we have to come. But also, I think that some of the things that I think about is, it's not actually just only, being stopped at the border or not being offered roles because of the fact that we're Muslim, or people yelling racist things at us. But it's also the other end of it is like young Muslim women, young Muslim children, like, have borne the brunt of so much conflict and of so much violence, and their voices, as you say, are completely unheard, right? And even when they do speak, people don't want to believe them, or they want to sort of save them. That really very old kind of colonial mentality of, like, we'll come and be the white saviors, right? As opposed to, let's just see what you need, empower you to do what you need. And maybe that's us not being in your country, or maybe that's, there are a whole bunch of other solutions to think about, but people don't think about Muslim women as free agents. I seriously sometimes think that that people think Muslim women are somehow either all sleeper cell jihadis or just like oppressed women waiting to be saved. Like, those are the tropes that we get, right? Like,
or seductive women in harems, just ready to please, But no, it's, so you and I can literally talk about this forever, and we usually always do. And we just blew through a significant portion of this hangout. So I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions that our audience members are submitting to us. And this one is actually perfect to go off of your question about what gives us hope. One user asked, how can we be resilient in our beliefs as young millennial Muslim women when we are constantly struggling between being too cultural in non-Muslim countries and then being too westernized or American in our Muslim communities? This one definitely, I think hits the nail on the head of what the experience is like. But, I think the resilience comes, a lot from just being authentic to our own voices, being true to our own narratives and experiences and our stories, and never really shying away from them. Because it's important, when you do that, it makes it less easy for you to also step on the toes of another culture, for example, or, feel like you can represent, so many different, walks of life, when really you can only speak to your own experience. You can only really be true to your own voice. And by doing that, I think that's the best way that we can really shine a spotlight on what those experiences are like, in a way that will allow people to empathize with us and understand where we're coming from. But I do also think that it's cool that we are walking this middle road, and also to understand that not a lot of people, this middle road that we are walking right now also isn't representative of all Muslims, for example. And to me, it seems like that's the defined image of who Muslims are, right? It's like we're the immigrant story, right? We're the outsider, we're the one that just came to this country and stuff like that. But also there are Muslims that aren't living that experience. Black Muslims in America, for example, many came here, were brought here on slave ships and literally built this country, and have literally formulated what American Islam is and laid the foundation for that. And I feel like you know, really just clinging to these identity politics or these differences based on those experiences just further affirms this type of, you know, one-dimensional image of who Muslims are, when we should be very open to allowing like many different stories to kind of fill that void. I think that's the only way that we can really push back against this image of us being a homogenous group.
Yeah, I'm going to build off that. I think, Amani, you're totally right. And I think sometimes when I was younger, I definitely also felt the pressure to be a certain type of Muslim because I wanted to make sure that, you know, I represented in the best way possible or whatever. But I think to the questioner, the thing that was sort of most helpful for me was I then went away and tried to learn about Islam. Like, I think growing up, I learned a lot about Islam just through my parents and like through bits and pieces that I learned at school. But really going away and trying to study the history of my faith, and you know, I'm interested in feminism in Islam. So how that came about, who the how Sharia came about, who were the different kind of power holders, all of that kind of thing. So you get a much deeper and more intimate understanding of the faith, and then you can make it your own, right? I think we live in a time where everybody has an opinion on what a Muslim should look like, whether it's your uncle in the community or, you know, old mate on television. But for me, the important thing is the relationship in Islam between you and Allah. And if you can kind of have a relationship that you feel comfortable with between you and Allah, then really, and I mean, this is the kind of the very Muslim-y kind of part of it, then everything is taken care of. And I think a lot of the experiences that I go through and the challenges and so on, you can kind of look at it through the lens of, hey, we're never put in a situation that we can't handle. Like Allah will never put you in a situation that you can't handle. And like, it's all an opportunity to learn something more about yourself or your faith. So yes, the pressure from our communities, and yes, the pressure from you know, whether Western or not, is going to be tough and a lot. But just remember to come back to, well, what is my relationship with Allah? What are my responsibilities to Allah? And try to focus on that as well.
I think that's so true. And, you know, I think that goes into this user's question really perfectly. I think a lot of it can overlap as well, is that basically what they're saying is it's exhausting and extremely tiring, always explaining the multidimensional side of being a Muslim woman. What are some things that help you? Yeah, for sure. What are some things that help you continue to want to fight and not just give up? What are your recharges? And I think that, I mean, to me, that kind of like goes into a lot of what you were saying, right? A lot of the themes that we have kind of touched upon during this. You know, for me personally, on a personal level, it is remembering that, you know, we are extremely privileged in the greater context of things. I mean, even with the levels of violence and conflict and adversity that we are up against right now, even though we lack a lot of the privileges that our counterparts do in our respective countries, we also, on a grander scale, are some of the most privileged people on the earth. And so I think that keeping things in context with that, like contextualizing that, and, you know, for us, that Muslim girl, I think that has always been a huge motivation for us. It's like, yes, this gets exhausting and it sucks having to blog about this every day, cover these issues every day, tell these stories every day. But we're constantly reminded of the fact that there are still Muslim women in other parts of the world that are suffering as a result of a lot of these misunderstandings and a lot of this Islamophobia that we have the privileges and the resources to make a difference on, right? To like push the needle on. And so personally, it's like, I can't wake up in the morning and be aware of having all of these things available at my fingertips without feeling the absolute urgency to use them to the fullest extent to try to alleviate some of that suffering or some of that violence that Muslim women are experiencing. And, you know, it seems like kind of a moral obligation, you know, and it gets confusing saying that, because at the same time, we're also saying that, you know, we can't speak to the experiences of Muslim in other parts of the world, and we shouldn't have to answer to what Muslim actions are that have nothing to do with us, for example. But it's like there is that sense of moral obligation or more responsibility, not just as Muslim women, but I think as human beings. And I don't know, Yassmin, you could agree with me or not, but I think that that urgency that I feel and that possibly you feel as well is empowered by our Islamic faith.
Oh, 100%. I remember speaking to my mom about it when I was really young, and she was like, just remember, Yasmina, that one day you will be asked, like, you know, you were given these opportunities, you were given this privilege, you were given the, you know, you were brought up in Australia, you had access to this, this, and this. Like, what did you do with it? And again, it's also and I want to have a good answer, right? And, you know, it's also that there's an analogy around you standing in front of a huge fire, right? And there's only like a small bucket of water next to you. Like that bucket of water itself may not be able to put out the fire, but at least you contribute to the solution, right? And if each one of us have a bucket, maybe that then is able to put out that fire. But if all of us sort of say, well, it's too hard, like the fire is too big, why should I even bother? Then nothing will ever get done. That being said, though, I do think we are allowed to be kind to ourselves. I do think that this sort of stuff takes a toll. And I get you, girl, man. I am exhausted, right? And I imagine, Amani, like you get to the end of the day sometimes and you're just like, oh my God, I wish I didn't have to deal with this one thing. Like sometimes I will flip out at someone about one tiny thing and they'll be like, yo, it wasn't even worth that much anger. And I'm like, yeah, but that was the icing on the cake of a whole bunch of other stuff that I haven't responded to. And I think I've just gotten better at learning how to manage my energy. What I try to do is build like a support wall around me, right? I know we're not huge on walls, but like the idea to buffer me from like some of the outside world. So I have, you know, a couple of WhatsApp groups that like are filled with like my people, you know, my crew, that whenever anything goes down, I can just vent in, and I know they'll have my back. A couple of friends who I know that like, they might be my like comedy friends, right? So when I hang out with them, we don't talk about anything serious, even though we know that the world is exhausting. They're just like, we're going to escape for a little while. And I
think that was like how you and I first met. You were visiting Brooklyn, and we never met before, but we're like, let's link up and just like put all our shit out there. Like you and I have been through some stuff, you know, like let's recuperate, like let's regroup and stuff. And even though it's like intercontinental, like that connection still happens. And I agree with you. I think I'm the same way. That's what I do to recharge as well. It's just surround myself with people that can keep me grounded and also protect me and kind of like be that buffer, you know? Okay, next question. So this user says, ladies, thank you for being boss women. Oh, well, anytime. Thank you. Any advice for having authority in spaces like mosques, etc., that Muslim men typically have authority, aka how do you combat misogyny in Muslim communities? This is a really good question, because actually, like, one thing that has really shocked me is that sometimes during my speaking engagements, when I'm speaking to a predominantly Muslim audience, especially like young Muslim women, one question that I actually get more often than I had ever expected to is along the lines of, you know, how are we supposed to take up leadership positions in the Muslim community if our families believe that we should stay at home? And it's really sad to feel that that's still a question that we have to confront and combat, you know, but I think that especially within Muslim spaces, this is when it's absolutely necessary for us to call on our male allies to step up and take some of that heat, you know, and really help direct this thing forward, because there's only so much that we can do to really just change that framework that we have, as long as brothers are still trying to uphold it or still fighting to uphold it. Actually, like, there was an MSA that I just spoke at just a couple of weeks ago in the Midwest here in the States. And what had happened was, this is the first time that this MSA has seen an all-female executive board, which is like incredible. And, you know, the president is a Muslim girl, and it's so cool what they're doing. And, you know, bringing me to campus to speak was like a huge precedent that they were setting, you know, in terms of the dialogue that they were inspiring on campus within the Muslim context. And basically they explained to me that the brothers kind of like broke off, like that same night that my event was happening, their local mosque was hosting an event at the same exact time to kind of take away from the event that the MSA was hosting, and that the brothers have turned the mosque into that space that they can no longer preserve within the MSA, since the women were taking the lead on things. So it's like these fractures that we're seeing happen within the Muslim community, you know, within our mosques and stuff like that. These are things that our brothers absolutely need to be at the front of combating. And I think what I see happen that I think is extremely disheartening is a lot of times they turn to like bashing feminism, for example, because we as Muslims know that Islam laid the principles for feminism that we understand today, for gender equality. And Islam, in my opinion, is inherently feminist. And so a lot of times we see that like Muslim men, for example, and some Muslim women, they say there's no need for feminism, especially for us, you know, as Muslims, because we already have Islam and stuff like that. But it's like, how can you say that, right, and really prove that when you are also engaging in actions that directly are tearing down, you know, the vocality or the visibility of the Muslim woman within your space? You know, I think that really it's important in these moments for our brothers to take up that mantle and fight that good fight. And for the Muslim woman to not let up and not be discouraged by it, because it's gonna take some effort, it's gonna take some energy, but we have to not get discouraged by a lot of the noise that we hear. And a lot of times we try to justify things intrinsically through Islam, right? Like gives like religious justifications for why you should stay at home and you don't have to be at the masjid, and like, you know, the kids shouldn't be running around like making noise in the mosque and stuff like that. But it's like, that shouldn't discourage Muslim women. We need to remain absolutely confident in the fact that, you know, our religion absolutely upholds our place within our communities, especially as leaders. We literally don't have to look past Khadija and Aisha radiallahu anhum to see that. But also it's like, you know, here in America, for example, we have the Women's Mosque of America. It's based in Los Angeles. And I remember when it first was founded 2 or 3 years ago, there was this uproar within the Muslim community where a lot of people were like, this is un-Islamic. Why are you making it just a women's only space? But the real question at hand is, why did women feel the need to create their own space in the first place? And if we're not making sure that our mosques and our community, if we're not making sure those aren't safe spaces and including everyone that calls themselves a Muslim within those spaces, then it's like, how can we possibly blame people from branching out and trying to cultivate their own separate space and stuff like that? It's like, we need to be the ones leading the way on that front.
Oh, Amani, you just said so much of what I was thinking.
I'm so sorry. I drop it. There's so much to unpack. I know.
It's awesome. I mean, I think you're totally right. Like, it's definitely there is rife misogyny within the Muslim community, as there is within every community in the world, actually. But there's certainly, I think the pernicious thing that happens is that people, what they like to do is justify their misogyny through Islam. And so the way that I've learned to combat that is, again, learn my Islam, so that when they turn around and say this, I'll be like, la, but actually, do you know why? It's like that actually is the wrong interpretation. Or actually, there is nothing that says X, Y, Z. Or actually, you know what? The Prophet ﷺ married a woman who was his boss, 15 years older than him, a businesswoman, a wealthy businesswoman. And the only reason that Islam could proliferate was because she funded him. She was essentially the VC, right? Like, Khadija was the OG VC up in here. She was a venture capitalist in Islam. And she had 4 children, or 4, I think. She was a widow. Like, all of these things today would stress you out. And she was the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. So you can't, like, when people come at me with, like, women should be at home, I'll be like, not in Islam. Not in Islam. Because we actually have it cannot be Islamically justified, in my view, when you look at the women that were in the Prophet's life, ﷺ. He was saved by a woman who was a knight for her. Like, he was saved by a woman who was in war, right? And you want to tell us that we stay at home? No. Or
at the very least, that it's like a choice. If you want to stay home, that's totally fine, but it's like a choice to do that, and it's not You know, like, for example, the fact that in Islam, Muslim women aren't obligated to go to pray at the mosque, for example, right? But it's like men, a lot of times we see like Muslim men try to use that as like, no, you don't have to go to the mosque, so you stay home. Yeah, exactly. And like kind of like literally taking the choice out of it, which defeats the purpose. I mean, that's the same thing as with the hijab, you know, like the hijab is 100% a personal choice. But, you know, just like you mentioned, misogyny exists in every community. And just like any community can find tools to subjugate women, the hijab just so happens to be the tool within our religious community, our background, that is used to subjugate women only when that choice is taken away. But it's not inherent to the actual practice. But yeah, like seeing that misogyny attributed to the religion itself, and then to see Muslim brothers participate in that by trying to religiously justify their assumptions of what Muslim women's place should be, it's extremely discouraging. It's a lot to deal with. But sisters, stay strong. Know that you're on the right side of history. You're on the right path. And, you know, ultimately, we're all just walking in the legacy of a long, long history of Muslim women, strong Muslim women leaders, and feminists that have literally paved the way for our understanding of Islam today as we know it. And if only we talked about that even nearly as much as we talk about things like terrorism, for example, then maybe we would have a better understanding of such a widely misunderstood community. Okay, moving through the questions. This one's directed at me from a user saying, what do you think the impact of Muslim Girl is? How does it move the needle? I mean, I think that the impact of Muslim Girl is exactly along the lines of what Yassmin and I detailed as an intrinsic need for our community at this time, and that is to elevate our voices, to reclaim our narratives, and to put our organic, authentic stories out there. The way that it moves the needle is by sharing these stories, by creating that presence for our voices in our respective societies. It builds those bridges. It makes it much more difficult for those stereotypes to exist within this vacuum if we are present and we're able to speak to our own experiences. And in that way, kind of like something that we just described that happened historically, right? Literally just within the past 2 decades of Muslim women, for example, being declared to be oppressed or voiceless. And in that way, we're disempowered even further. And all these policies are enabled to be created through those misunderstandings about Muslim women, for example, that ultimately impact us. We move the needle by making sure that our stories, our voices are really shifting public opinion on these issues, are creating a resource for people to understand how these issues, how this time period impacts us right now, how it impacts us directly. And really just historically, like especially since 9/11, for example, the conversation has constantly revolved around Muslim women, but rarely included Muslim women to be the ones to do the talking. And so what the ideal that we are pushing for right now is to make it impossible for us to have a conversation about Muslim women without including Muslim women, which you would assume to be a no-brainer, but you would be surprised. And ultimately in that way, like we're building up institutions, right? And I think that's something that, you know, going back to your original question, Yassmin, about what gives me hope. One thing that seriously gives me hope about my generation, for example, like I call our generation the 9/11 generation. Whether we like it or not, we've come to be defined by this moment that has cast our entire, you know, religious community kind of as like the scapegoat of our generation right now. It, you know, the pendulum swings every couple of decades. And right now, this is the situation we find ourselves in. And really, it's like, you know, for us, it makes me so proud to see that generation that grew up, like, you know, with our hands tied behind our backs almost, with all of these different like wars and atrocities and tragedies like happening on our watch. We are now building these institutions like Muslim Girl and like so many more initiatives coming out of Muslim millennials, coming from our generation right now, to really push back on those things in very innovative ways, especially in the social media era. And it makes me hopeful for the next generation of Muslim kids that are unfortunately growing up through a very similar atmosphere right now, that at the very least, maybe we're going to make it a little bit easier for them. You know, like maybe this time around, at least we're here, we've been through this, we already know how it goes, and we can offer the support, the resources necessary. We can build the backbone that our community needs that we didn't have growing up, so that we can be able to survive and ultimately thrive through this together.
Oh man, that makes me feel so happy. I think you're right. Like, we all, like, as you said earlier, we all walk in the footsteps of others and in the legacy of others. And because we know what it's like to be in, like, our parents, essentially, our parents were the generation in like Australia anyway, my parents were the generation that built the mosques, right? And our generation is the generation that built the institutions, right? The social institutions. I started Youth Without Borders, and I run an organization called Mumtaza, which is around, women of color more broadly. But we built, people started the MSAs and Al-Nisa and, all these other kind of youth organizations that were about supporting kind of socially the young Muslim women, the young Muslims in the community. And I think, the next generation, I do believe, is reaping the rewards of that and will continue to build, because the next generation I'm so excited about and is super woke. And I also think we might be running out of time. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, I think that we're actually going to take the last question right now.
Okay, let's do it.
Do you have the last one yet? It's coming up, Yassmin.
All right, dun dun dun.
But I mean, I think that's, if there's one thing that we want to kind of like make sure that everyone that listens in with us right now can kind of take away with them in this conversation about No Country for Young Muslim Women, is really just how these issues impact us directly and how there are reasons for them, right? Like there is a framework in place right now that is making these experiences much more difficult for certain facets of our society than others. And ultimately, we need to be able to elevate those silenced and marginalized and underrepresented voices in the conversations impacting them, so that we are able to have conversations like this, for example, to promote greater understanding and to really be able to progress together forward. And okay, so I have the last question. And basically, I guess this is continuing off of exactly what we were just discussing, which is what are our hopes for the future? And of course, would love to hear if we have any upcoming projects, if there's anything that you're working on or anything that we can share with everybody. But basically, where do we go from here?
Well, I think that we have to have hope, right? And we have to believe, like, if you're coming at it from a Muslim...
Easier said than done, Yassmin, but I agree with you.
If you're coming at it from a Muslim perspective, always believe that Allah's got a plan, right? And like, at the end of the day, when all else fails, I'm like, oh, Allah wanted this to happen. And that may be me abdicating responsibility, or that may be me kind of accepting what has happened in my life, obviously, as what is meant
Everything serves its purpose.
Right, everything serves its purpose. And I think we should also just like have faith in each other and the strength of our community. We are so resilient. Look at what we've been through as a community, and we're out here lit, thriving, alhamdulillah. We out here, like, there was no fashion labels out for like cool young Muslim women, so people are like making their own fashion lines. There was no website, so we made our own. There was no this, so we are literally creating what wasn't there for us. And I think that is incredible, and it will only get better, inshallah. We're also part of an enormous, like, the Muslim people, I think there's some stat like half of the people who are Muslim are under the age of 30. Like, I think that's a stat. It's like a huge percentage of young Muslim people, and that potential is super exciting. So to be part of the coolest kind of next up and coming generation of people, because the magic happens when there is conflict and when there is political tension and all that. That's where real creativity is born. So we are part of an amazing generation, I think, that I'm really excited to be a part of. In terms of things to rep, I've got a web series actually coming out on May 1st called Hijabistas. It's about hijabi fashion in Australia specifically, but you can find out more about it on my Instagram or website or whatever. And yeah, I'm Yassmin_A on Twitter and Instagram and all the interwebs. So please check me out. And actually, I've just decided to take on 3 to 5 people a month to mentor. So if you're interested in being mentored, and you're under the age of 30, head to my Instagram, and there's like a little application in the highlights, that a link to my application form. So
love it. I co-sign that. I highly encourage you guys to try to get to be Yassmin's mentor. That would for sure be an experience like no other. Trust. For sure, you know, I echo all of your sentiments. Like I feel really hopeful. I mean, I think at the very least, we know that people have our backs, you know, like it should never have taken an increase in violence or racism or anything like that to get people to show or vocalize their support. But I think the fact that it is more visible now, and we can see that people do understand the moment that we're in, and that these divides call for greater oneness and unity, that to me fills me especially with hope. It's like at the end of the day, you know, like I'm one of those people that believes in the human nature being good, and that I think that's going to be what really leads us into the future. And I hope that's going to be what leads us into the future, instead of some of the current competing powers that be. But we'll leave that open-ended. And I guess that really comes down to us at the end of the day, right? To the people that are the ones that are creating, that are putting their voices out there, that are refusing to take no for an answer. I think it really comes down to us and where we draw the line. And I'm really excited that Muslim Girl is dropping a new merch collection called the Aura Shields collection. And it is going to be a series of hats, each with a feminist saying on top of them that really take what's kind of like going on in our heads and puts them on our heads. You know, like one of my favorites is a hat that says "End Wallah Bro Culture," because we can do enough with that. You know, we can do with far less Wallah Bros in the world. But keep an eye out for that. It'll be dropping on muslimgirl.com and especially on our Instagram. And with that, Yassmin, I know it's late for you over there. Girl, thank you so much for still refusing to take that no for an answer and making sure that we have this conversation no matter what. And, you know, just I'm so happy for everyone that got to be involved in this conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in, and, you know, make sure to share with your friends and let them know about the festival that's happening right now and all the incredible people that are taking part in it. And with that, hope you all have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.